I feel like a politician. I've got like 2 mics, or how many mics? I'm wearing 2, and there's 2 more here. I should pronounce something. Okay, so I am Jeremy Tankard, as Werner and Leslie said. I'm sorry, I'm a little nervous, so I don't often get to talk with grown-ups. So I'm an author-strader, and I was explaining to Dennis and his wife a minute ago that it's a title that I love. It was given to me by a grade 3 student in Moncton, New Brunswick, who was clearly the smartass of his class, who spent the entire 45-minute presentation that I gave thinking. It was clear that he came up with this word in the first minute of my presentation when I said I'm an author and an illustrator, because the second I asked, are there questions, after 45 minutes of talking, his hand shot up. I said, yes. And he said, okay, so if you're an author and an illustrator, doesn't that make you an author-strader? And he waited for the roar of laughter from his classmates, who I think were a little confused. And I said, actually, I am an author-strader. So I've been an author-strader ever since then. And I'm going to talk about things. Oh, yeah, lights would be great. Thank you. There we go. Okay, this is Jeremy Tankard, age 4. And like a great many Canadians, I'm not from Canada, I'm from South Africa. This is my passport photograph. And anybody who has seen me present to kids is familiar with this photograph. I love this photograph mostly because my mom loves it so much. Because I was 4 when this picture was taken. I'm now 40 years old. My mom will be very quick. She luckily does not see this photo very often, because I keep it stashed in a little collection in my house. But she'll laugh when she says it and say, Jeremy, you might be 40 years old, but you still look exactly the same. Well, guys, check this out. If I'm not smiling, I can do this. It's not my best look, but I'm going to kind of give you a very quick to be in how did I get where I got. So I was born in South Africa to English South African parents. And you can just look at that for a minute while I give you the backstory. My family left when I was 4 and a half for a new and much better life, hopefully, in the United States. We moved to Columbia, South Carolina, Hazard, Kentucky, and Knoxville, Tennessee in the course of about 3 years. So by the time I was 8, I'd been to 4 different schools, 4 different cities, 4 different teachers, everything was new every year for a few years. So my brain took off and went for a little vacation. And as I'm learning as an adult and having my own kids, moving is really difficult for kids, even if you think they're very resilient. And I luckily have an incredible family who were very supportive of me. But by the time I got to the age of 7 in grade 2 in Knoxville, Tennessee, I was really struggling with school. Because, like I say, my brain took off because it just had enough. It quit. So I would go to school, and on math worksheets, in grade 2, I don't know how many math worksheets you actually get, but I do remember math worksheets and quizzes. And I wouldn't actually read math questions. I would just look at the blank space where the answer was supposed to go, and I would write numbers down. And I like big numbers, so 21 plus 3, that's 10,000. It's got to be, so write in 10,000. 9 minus 1, 52. So I always try and tell kids, like, learn from my mistakes. It doesn't work. I failed math. But the other thing, which is probably a much bigger problem in terms of school and life, was reading. I hated reading. I passionately hated reading, in fact. It was one of my least favorite things to do. I loved books. I liked looking at pictures. I loved stories. I wanted my dad or my mom or a librarian or a teacher to read those to me. And my parents are very smart. My mom is a librarian. My dad is a scientist, and I believe quite world-renowned in his own field. So they're smart people, and they knew that I was a smart kid. And so they were very worried having a little boy who was not doing very well in school. And they were particularly concerned about the reading. And my mom, being a librarian, used to spend a lot of time at home trying to encourage me to read and working with me on pronouncing things, what sound do these letters make. And she knew that I could read, but she never heard me read more than a few words at a time. But Mrs. Smith, my grade 2 teacher, she used to make us read, like do silent reading in class. But I was very observant. So I learned from watching my parents, who read a lot, that when grown-ups are reading, they look at the page and they kind of just flick their eyes back and forth. Turn the page, flick their eyes back and forth. Turn the page, flick their eyes back and forth. And I thought, I can do that. It's easy. So for that 20 minutes a day in school, that's what I would do. I would just sit there and think, okay, how long would it actually take to read this page? Flick my eyes back and forth until I thought that was roughly the right amount of time, and then turn the page. And I got so good at doing this that Mrs. Smith used me as an example for the class one day. She said, okay, I want everybody to stop working for a minute. Take a look at Jeremy. He's being such a good silent reader. But by the end of grade 2, Mrs. Smith had me all worked out. She'd figured out, okay, that boy is clearly not taking in anything that he's reading. So, excuse me, so she got together with my parents and said, your little boy is very nice. He's quiet. He's an incredible listener. He makes friends easily. He doesn't disrupt the class. He's a great kid. But he cannot go on to grade 3. He's just not there. He's going to get further behind. So I failed grade 2. And there's a reason I'm showing this one, is that my parents were so concerned about this that my dad one day stopped at a bookstore on his way home from work and bought me a chapter book. I think it had about 4 or 5 chapters. I don't remember what the book was now. He brought it home, sat down on the couch with me and said, okay, Jeremy, my boy, new book. This is good. New books are always good. But then he says, if you can read this entire book to me right now, I'll take you to the toy store and buy you anything you want. All right, you're on. Took the book, cracked it open, read the whole thing to my dad. Big hard words, sounded them out carefully, got to the end, said the end, closed the book, said, let's go to the toy store, Dad. And he was totally floored. He looked at me and said, I had no idea you could do that. And my mom, who had kind of given up, she found it very frustrating trying to teach me to read, because kids, when they're learning, they can do great, and then the next day they can't remember how to do something. And she found that very difficult. But she watched this and she said, Jeremy, I had no idea you could read an entire book. And I said, I'm in grade 2. Of course I can read a book. Let's go to the toy store. So off we trekked to the toy store, where I chose this beautiful tractor. It's quite large. It's made of metal. It weighs a ton. And you guys, obviously adults, you know what hoarders are. My dad is the opposite of a hoarder. He's a get rid of her. He does not keep things. They keep a very tidy, very clean, very neat house. But he kept this. And luckily he also kept my Lego. And I asked him when he took this photograph for me a couple of years ago, I said, Dad, of all the stuff, why did you keep this one? Because you got rid of all my other toys. And without even having to think about it, he said, well, I had to keep it to remind me to never bribe you ever again. But for me, actually, I'm very glad that he did keep it, because every time I'm in Calgary and see my kids playing with this, or every time I look at the photograph of it, it's kind of interesting for me to kind of remember. There was a time where I hated reading so much that I had to be bribed with expensive toys to do it, even if it was only once. So I failed grade 2, but then I did it again when we moved to Canada. I had the most remarkable teacher who taught me to love school. And she did not teach me to love reading. That came when I was about 31. But, so I've loved reading for a whole 9 years now. I've got a lot of catching up to do. I didn't like school. I loved drawing. And drawing was my retreat. It was also my brother's retreat. We spent hours creating worlds and writing stories and drawing things. And for me, drawing was never just about a piece of art. I'm going to draw a squirrel and Mom will put it on the fridge. It was never about that. It was almost always about a story. I love telling stories. And I didn't like reading books, but I like to make them. And so I'm just going to show you a few pages very quickly from the only book that I've got left from my childhood. I made this when I was 7. It was called The Book of Stories, and the first story in it is called Space. And there's a little astronaut pig over here. He's been exploring the moon on his little moon rover. He's squealing, wee! Nice easy word to spell. Vroom, the rocket, or the car drives up into the rocket. vroom, the rocket engines are starting up, and then the rocket takes off. But this pig was not too bright. You can see his feet sticking out here. He forgot to do up his seatbelt, forgot to close the door. His car is falling out, and he's screaming, "Help!" And despite having a red marker, I did not know how to draw the accident that was about to happen. So I wrote the end, story done, started another one called A Picnic, in which the pigs decide to go for a picnic. "Let's go for a picnic," one of them says. They all get in the car, they all squeal, "Wee!" Vroom. Wee is a great word when you're a kid because it doesn't matter how many E's you put in it. It's nice and easy. The same with vroom. "Let's go on the boat," says the daddy pig. And the mummy pig says, "Yes." And actually, only as an adult, I've noticed that the beach umbrella is a bat on a stick. I'm not sure what kind of protection that would give you from the sun, but the little pigs over here, they've made a nice little sand castle. And so they all get in the boat, and they'll say bye-bye, bye-bye, because they've had their picnic. It's spelled wrong, obviously. Up at the top, I wrote the end, because the story was done. I thought about it. The story's not done. I'm 7. This book needs pigs driving speedboats. And when I got tired of pigs and speedboats, then it was the end. And I started a nonfiction chapter about my Hot Wheels collection. So that's why I but what I actually find very interesting about these as an adult is I was no better of an artist than any other kid in grade 2. But having grown up to be a storyteller, there's something that I think is very cool about this book. It has 64 pages in it, but it actually tells a true story. And when I was 7 and I drew it, I had no idea there was a true story in it. But the true story was about my family moving to Canada, because they had to do a huge sales job on me and Andrew, my little brother, about Canada, because we didn't want to move again, because moving sucks. So the rocket ship has Canadian flags. Actually, the astronaut over here has 3 little Canada flags on his spacesuit. There's a flag on the sandcastle way over on that side. There's one on the speedboat, but the rest of the book had all these other clues about we were moving to Calgary. The book was full of cowboy hats and pistols and Lone Ranger masks. And this stuff just cropped up in the drawings, so I think that's kind of interesting. Excuse me. As I got older, I continued to draw and tell stories. I got very interested in comics. I didn't like reading, but I would read comics. And my mom, being a librarian, and at the time was very disapproving of comics, but very approving of anything the library had. So I could read anything that the library had. But back then, libraries only had Asterix and Tintin. So I read those a lot. I don't know how many times I've read all those books. But I fell in love with pirates and ships. So this is probably age 10, maybe 9. No, probably 10. So writing comics about pirates and adventures on the high seas. This is probably about age 11, maybe 12. An adventure with Vikings, more pirates. This is probably like age 13, maybe. Kids never date their work, so I don't know how old I was. I'm guessing about 13. But by the time I was 19 in high school, I was convinced I was not going to go to university. I was going to spend the rest of my life drawing Spider-Man or Batman or Superman. And I started drawing and reading comics, because by then I could buy my own comics. And I finished high school at the age of 19. And the summer between high school and university, I started seriously pitching work to Marvel and DC Comics. I got a huge stack of rejection letters. By the end of my first year in art college, I was this close to a gig with Marvel Comics. But at that point I quit, because I just didn't like it. I liked comics. And actually there was a particular story that I started writing here. This was the one I quit on, because by that point I was getting rejection letters that weren't just a standard, we're sorry, but we can't offer you a position. They had these long critiques of the work where they said, you started out so great, but by page 3, ... And it was always this kind of, I'd had 2 or 3 rejections that were kind of this question mark of, if you had managed to keep this up, maybe. So I got about halfway through one last submission featuring these big, muscly, super kind of characters. And then my friend got a job working for Marvel Comics like that. First time he sent something in, they hired him. And so we would sit around his parents' coffee table. He would work on a Batman story for DC Comics. And I would be working on my next submission. And after a few weeks of watching Carrie do this, I was like, I can't do that. He was so stressed out. The deadlines were crazy. And at that point, I managed to actually reassess my work and say, you know what? I couldn't meet those deadlines. Or even if I could, it wouldn't be fun anymore. This work doesn't look like mine. It looks like Frank Frazetta and Bernie Wrightson and all these comic book artists that I liked. And I was like, okay, it's not mine anymore. But in my sketchbooks, meanwhile, I started drawing comics just for fun and writing them with a friend of mine. And so they were kind of very goofy versions of us, of me and my art college friends and what the shenanigans that happened in our studio. But I finished art college with a fine arts diploma. I do not have a degree. Excuse me. But by the time I was in my final year of art college, the college had finally decided to open up a computer lab for the fine arts students. The design students already had a computer lab. We were allowed to use it, but only if they didn't need it. So we would slip in odd hours of the day or night to use the computer lab. But by my fourth year in art college, we had our own dedicated computer labs. So me and I think 3 or 4 other guys started a little magazine in the college just for the sake of playing with Adobe Photoshop and Illustrator and Quark Express. And all of it, it's funny because we all studied fine art, but 3 of them became designers. They're all very successful designers. And I became an illustrator. But back then, I think we started on Photoshop 2, which is a long time ago. And it was quite limited in what it could do. But for me, it was the introduction to a computer can do anything. It was like magic paper, or it was a magic pencil. It could do absolutely anything. And it was very easy to kind of run away with special effects on a computer. And I got very interested in collage. So I started doing photo collage, and I would take my paintings, and I would take photographs of people, I would scan them, and then rebuild them Frankenstein style in the computer to create these kind of Marilyn Manson album cover art pieces. They were really fun. All with a very fine arts kind of sensibility, though. And I went to New York City. So these were all based on my fine art practice, but trying to find ways of using digital technology and integrating it with printmaking, which I was studying, and with painting and drawing, which I was interested in, and with photography, it was really exciting. The things you could do with a computer were amazing. Some of them are more subtle and more painterly, I guess. I became very interested in being able to mix photographs with drawings. But then I went to New York City after a couple of years. Post-graduation, I worked as a graphic designer. I had to beg and plead with designers to give me a chance because I didn't have a degree in design. I had to sort of come in through the back door by doing production work and just working. I volunteered at one studio just to prove that I could do it. And I worked for Arlene Dickinson of Dragon's Den fame for about 1.5 years. And she was an amazing person to work with. And she paid really well. So I saved my money for 1.5 years so that I could move to Toronto and not have to work. I think I saved up enough to live for 1 year without any income, which was pretty good. But the funny thing was I went to New York determined to be an illustrator. So I had all these pieces in my portfolio that I thought were great because they looked like Marilyn Manson album cover stuff as far as I was concerned. Who wouldn't want that? So I went to New York and started showing my book around, and I played up the small town kid seeking fame and fortune in the big city to get interviews with people. I'd cold call people at GQ magazine and say, hey, I'm a small town kid coming to seek fame and fortune. You got to meet with me. And they would laugh and say, oh, yeah, okay, we'll meet with you. Which is funny because they didn't meet with people for the most part. I went there. And the funny thing is I had a meeting with a guy who was a hugely successful illustrator who lived in Calgary. He was huge in the 80s. He'd made, I don't know how much money he made. He was very successful. And he sat down and looked at my portfolio, which was full of this kind of stuff. And he said, you know what, Jeremy? This stuff is awesome, It would look great on my wall. But what's any sensible art director going to do? It's like, oh, Doug, screw you. I'm going to go to New York City and I'm going to show you wrong. I went to New York City and the first guy I met was, I think, Stephen Heller at the New York Times. And he looked at my book. He's kind of renowned for actually meeting with people who are new and have never been heard of before. He met with me and he said, this stuff is great. It would look awesome on my wall. But I'm sorry, I can't use it. It's like, oh, damn it, Doug, you were right. And every meeting I had, people said, well, you know what? I love some of this stuff. It's interesting textures, interesting colors. You're doing stuff on the computer that's kind of cool. Not totally original, but it's kind of interesting. But we can't use it. And so I was proven absolutely wrong by this illustration teacher. So I came to Toronto and tried the same thing. And luckily in Toronto, instead of 1 and 2 minute long meetings with people, I managed to get like half-hour long meetings with people. And I'd run out, I didn't have a lot of stuff to show, so I would, after people had gone through my portfolio, they'd say, so what else you got? And I'd take out a sketchbook just to stay in their office longer. And people would start going through my sketchbooks, which were full of extremely silly things. And finally, one guy said, you know what? The stuff in your sketchbook, these are dumb, but they're fun. So these are like the stupid things you draw when you're talking on the phone and you're not thinking about what you're doing. But the stuff in your portfolio is kind of rich and textural and kind of interesting, but ultimately has no purpose except going on a wall. So we said, why don't you take the stuff in your sketchbook and the stuff that in your portfolio, find a way to mash it all together, and then come back. And I was extremely disappointed. I didn't want to change my style. So I came back, went back to Calgary, and started drawing and focusing more on simplicity, maybe. Started drawing with ink again after a long time of not drawing with ink, but drawing with paint. And I got an opportunity to illustrate a bunch of poems for a university publication that my roommate was working on. And these are all kind of very goth. It was my goth phase, my early 20s. But it was pretty fun. And then I realized that, okay, this is starting to develop into a more interesting portfolio, but there's no color. So I started looking at like literary things. I read Moby Dick, cover to cover, every word. It took me about 6 months to do, but I did it. The kid who hates reading is no wonder I hated reading. But I read Moby Dick. I was like, I'm going to do a Moby Dick illustration. And then one of these little design companies I was working with started feeding me little bits of illustration work because he could get me for cheap because I was on salary for him. And so I got to do a cover for an annual report. Looking at the world through a child's eyes was their cheesy catchphrase for that year. They never used it, but every year, Gary, the designer, said, these guys, they always want to try something really new and exciting. So they would get me to do this illustration, and then I think it was for the Kootenai Savings and Credit Union. And they got this image, and they're like, oh, no. That kid is too Chinese. We can't use that. I was kind of offended, because Chinese kind of built the Rocky Mountain communities. So I changed it to a blonde kid. And then like, oh, no, you know what, we just can't use it, sorry. And they put a picture of mountains on the cover, which is what they do every year anyway. But it didn't matter. I got a piece for my portfolio that I got to flog around to local magazines, got me more work. For Avenue Magazine in Calgary, these guys actually paid me $500 to do 3 whole illustrations about gridlock and traffic problems. But boy, they didn't know what traffic problems were back then. Gridlock then, now is terrible. But I got more and more interested in actually taking photographs and mixing them with my drawings. And they're starting to develop an illustration style with very far apart eyes. And they're kind of creepy and fun, but I started to find ways of cutting corners, like taking photographs of things, holding them up against a window and then tracing them. Saved a lot of time, and I got drawings like the inside of a subway car that looked kind of like the inside of a subway car without having to do much work. Illustration taught me that if you are being paid $500 and it takes you 10 hours to do the illustration, that's $50 an hour. That's not so good. But if I can cram that all into 1 hour, that's $500 an hour. It's starting to look like a pretty good business. National Post hired me. Then we moved to Toronto, like I said, with this chunk of money to live for a year and try and make it. And started getting work. It was small stuff. This was for a law firm. National Post, Business Magazine, letters page. I had a friend in London, England, from South Africa, moved to London, England. He knew I was an illustrator, and he was doing like a fashion magazine. He asked me to try and come up with something kind of fashion-y in my style. It was actually a drawing of Heather, who is my now other half. And this is my friend Alden over there with a dinosaur on his head. He never used it. He managed to actually get a very famous British fashion illustrator to fill that space, unfortunately, but whatever. It was fun. When I grow up, I'm going to have X-ray vision and pants that make me fly. When I grow up, I want to be Bionic Woman and run really fast in slow motion. This, for me, like these two pieces were the absolute breakthrough career pieces for me, because this guy, he wanted all the textures of these kind of pieces, but he really wanted superheroes. And he didn't want like Marvel Comics superheroes that I drew when I was 19. He wanted goofy, I'm talking on the phone, not paying attention to what I'm doing kind of superheroes. So I started painting with acrylics and drawing and doing these really bold, silly things. And to my surprise, a lot of people responded to them. These got used in an ad campaign right across the country. I got paid more money to do these than I'd ever been paid before, but it wasn't a lot in retrospect. And then started thinking, okay, I got to rebrand myself. Started doing many more of these kind of things, trying to appeal to the people who liked them. And the other breakthrough for me was spending a small fortune doing a big mailer, trying to get work out of the United States, trying to get the attention of anybody in the United States to hire me to work. So I sent out 4,000 pieces in the mail one month. I spent a fortune on printing. There were 3 postcards, 4,000 people to mail these 3 postcards to, stuffed them in envelopes. It took weeks licking envelopes and stamping things. And the first phone call was from somebody in San Francisco saying, please take me off your mailing list. Second one was somebody in Chicago saying, please take me on the mailing list. And I was really depressed because this cost a lot of money. The third one was Time Magazine saying, we love your work. Would you like to do a piece? And they hired me. I worked for them for about a year, doing all kinds of illustrations. I think I did 7 or 8 pieces with them, and they paid really well. And then all of a sudden, a whole lot of people who hadn't been interested started saying, can we see your portfolio again? So these were for Time. This was for Time Magazine. I don't own a television, and they actually hired me to illustrate a piece about families who don't have TVs, unaware that we did not own a television. And this little girl, I fell in love with her when I drew her. She's been cropping up in my sketchbook over the years, and she has now become Clover the Uncredible, which is an upcoming book. And the funny thing is, when I drew her the first time, I said, I want that kid. And then Hermione, my daughter, was born in 2001, and she is that kid, absolutely. Sometimes. She's got the personality that is way too big for her little body. Brad Pitt, for some movie magazine, had an article about big budget Hollywood movies looking like comic books. Piggy Bunny. There's a recipe section in a magazine. The recipe was called Pork Bunnies. But eventually it did get turned into a book as well by Rachel Vale. It was for advertising, grocery store. Time Magazine, this one won an award from American Illustration, which was, for me, it was really exciting. I walked around bragging for a long time because I think I was 27, and I thought it was really cool that, and Time Magazine, this is one of my favorite things with Time Magazine, because you never meet clients when you're an illustrator. They actually had a bet going around their New York offices about how old I was. And the one art director said, Jeremy is 33. The other one said, he can't be 33, that's too young. He's 55. And so finally they phoned me one day and said, okay, Jeremy, you got to settle a bet for us. How old are you? I said, I'm 27. They're like, no, you're not 27. And it was a huge ego boost and very flattering because she said, no, generally speaking, by the time you're working for Time, a lot of the illustrators are more mature. She said, for some reason, there's a maturity in your style. I'm not sure I see it, but it was very flattering. Scholastic started hiring me to do pieces for various Scholastic magazines. Jimi Hendrix for Guitar Player magazine did a piece on making sure your guitar has insurance. Fortune magazine, piece on what the business world can learn from the world of psychedelic drug use. I, for the record, have never been a drug user, but had a hell of a time going through archives of old album covers from the psychedelic era, and then trying to do a corporate illustration based around that. It was tremendously fun. I can't remember who I did that for. That was for a newspaper. It's for a kid's environmental magazine. And over the years, the work went from kind of very complicated, realistic, it's got more and more simple. And I got very interested in Chinese Zen brush painting and sumi-e ink drawing and Japanese woodblock printing, especially Hokusai, famous for the wave. He published a book called Selections from the Manga. And they were collections of doodles and sketches that he did, and they were amazing. So I got more and more interested in how much can you express with how little. And then starting to apply kind of a comic book aesthetic to it as well. Online grocery delivery, when that was new, it's a piece for Canadian Living. Birds. A mad scientist pig. Pork power actually was the title of the article. I don't know what it was about, but the title was so good. This is for Sunlight Soap. So I got to work with some pretty great clients, but then at the same time, because the work was getting more and more simple, I started to panic, thinking, oh no, am I losing skills? So went back to the beginning, went back to stuff that I learned in art college and started doing figure drawing and painting, just out of fear that I was going to lose it, or lose skills. I'm not sure that one does lose those skills, but I started learning oil painting just for fun. I no longer do oil painting because it's very toxic. That's my favorite one. So these were all, I still, in my illustration practice, try to keep drawing things other than cute animals. I took on some graphic design work somewhere in there when somebody said, design is easy, just treat it like an illustration. Use your photographs and type as though the same way you would anything in your illustrations. It's like, oh, that's how design works. Okay, I can do that. I got Design a Magazine. I did an album cover for, a couple of album covers for friends who had bands. This one was fun actually, because the band, it was two guys, Tom and Dave, and they had a kind of a rotating stable of drummers, so they didn't want me to draw the drummer on the album cover. But they had a song about dinosaurs, so I'm like, I'm going to put the dinosaur on there as the drummer. And they thought that was very funny. Fine art piece. Dallas News hired me to do some pieces. This kid eating chocolate. You've seen this one before, Werner. This is the low point of my illustration career, but it's also the high point. I got to illustrate an article for a health magazine called Apples Rock. I got the article, I thought, oh, I know what I have to draw for Apples Rock. And I drew this, it took 10 minutes. I phoned my friend Aaron, I emailed it to my friend Aaron, then phoned him and said, check your email. You gotta see what I just drew. So he drew it and he read that Apples Rock. He's like, he phoned me, we were talking on the phone, he's like, Jeremy, that's low, that's terrible. I said, I know, I got paid $500 to do it. So high point, I get paid to draw stupid things sometimes. Low point, it's a really dumb drawing. But Scholastic actually, with their magazines, they pigeonholed me, and they were very clear on this up front after doing 2 or 3 drawings. They said, Jeremy, we've pigeonholed you. I said, okay, so what have you pigeonholed me as? Actually, no, Time magazine were the first to do it. They told me, okay, we pigeonholed you. You're the kid guy. So I got a lot of kid family articles to illustrate. Scholastic, about 3 weeks later, when I was talking to their art director, said, we've pigeonholed you. I said, oh, okay. Am I the kid guy like I am with Time? He said, no, you're the creepy kid guy. So for them, I got to draw, I don't know if I have them right here, but I got to do these really weird drawings of cute kids, but they're always like as though they were being watched by adults all the time, and they're kind of panicking about it. I got to do a piece for Paul Yee, Canadian children's author. He's amazing. I didn't meet him at the time, but it was for Kayak magazine. He wrote a little fiction piece, and I had tremendous fun illustrating it. I have since met Paul Yee, and he lived up to every expectation I had. He's amazing. About this time, illustration work in 2001 started getting really slow for every freelancer on the planet, I think. Certainly illustrators and photographers. I know a lot of people who quit altogether. I was lucky enough to have clients who got me through that. But I also had one friend, Marcus Chin, who did all those Lava Life ads that we saw all over subways for a couple of years. Marcus, I think, probably made a small fortune doing those ads at a time when a lot of artists were not making money. And other artists like him were kind of taking a very fashion-oriented, they were trying to make things sexy and cool. And so I thought, okay, Marcus is doing really well. And I've got the skills to do that. So if I can find a way to take my style and bend it into doing that work. So I tried. But nobody was interested. They wanted cute stuff. But then about the same time, my daughter was born in 2001, which was very exciting. I started reading kids' books again. I was also approached by a comic book publisher who said, I'll give you 8 pages, whatever you want to write, I'll publish it in this anthology. And because he wasn't paying, because it was a very small press, I could get away with anything I wanted. And I got to be in an anthology with a couple of very famous comic book artists whose work I adored. And the book sold out, which is the publisher, didn't expect. And I wrote this story about a superhero. They were all superhero stories in this anthology. There's only a couple of pages of it here. But he published it. I tried to cram much too much into it, and that was ultimately not very successful. I met an editor. Oh, how short can I tell this story? I approached publishers in New York about working on children's books because I was reading kids' books again with Hermione and getting really excited because I went to art college because I love children's books. And so I printed up a little portfolio, mailed out, I think, 35 copies. I said, I'm going to start with the big ones in New York because I want to make money. And everybody knows there is no money in children's publishing. So I'm going to start with the only people who might have money, at least as far as I was aware. Mailed out these 35 things, and I got 6 responses, which was the highest return on investment I've ever had from a mailing. And they were Viking, HarperCollins, Clarion, Scholastic, Candlewick. There's one other. FS&G. And so I thought, holy cow, I didn't expect that. I'm going to go to New York and see how serious these guys actually are. Flew there. And the really fun thing, this is a big ego trip for me, so excuse a little ego story here. I had been approached by an editor at Viking years before and had lost touch with her. So actually Viking hadn't approached me with this mailer. But I thought, I'm going to go to New York. I'm going to try and hook up with Tracy at Viking because she said a few years ago she liked my work. So I cold called Viking and said, I need to speak with Tracy Gates. She's the executive editor. And they put me through. And I was kind of blown away by that. But I didn't actually get to talk with her because she doesn't answer phones. She has a receptionist of her own, little intern, I suppose, who answers her phone. And I said to the intern, look, Tracy emailed me a few years ago. She loved my work. And the receptionist said, well, Tracy gets a lot of calls and she's really busy. What's your number? So I gave her my phone number. She said, do you have a website? I said, yeah, I have a website. She took down my URL and said, okay, you know what? Seriously, she's busy. She's not going to get in touch with you. But I'll give it to her because you said that. She was very skeptical that I was telling the truth. But 5 minutes later, Tracy Gates phoned me and she said, my receptionist was telling me some weird story about me liking your work a few years ago. I said, yeah. She said, I don't remember that at all. But I'm on your website and your work is awesome. And she says you're coming to New York next week. Can you come and see me? I said, sure, I can come and see you. I've got time on Friday afternoon at whatever time. So I went and I met with all these publishers, and then I met with Tracy Gates at Viking for an hour and a half behind closed doors. And she went through my portfolio and she said some very flattering things. She said, when I look through a portfolio, I can tell you where you studied, who your influences are. I can tell you a lot about your work, some things you probably don't know about your work. And she said, I've been doing this for a long time, but I can't tell where you're from. Who did you study with? Where did you study? I can see some influences, but what? Where did they come from? And she got really excited. And I didn't really know because I don't think about it very much. So I sort of listed off, I like anime, I like Japanese comics, I like Jack Kirby, I like these Japanese and Chinese brush painters. And it was a kind of a weird hodgepodge of influences. And she said, oh, okay, you know what? I can see that. And then she made me an offer that I couldn't refuse. She said, I will look at anything you do. You can bypass all of our submissions procedures under one condition. You have to write it. And I don't care if you finish it, send it in. If you want to critique, send it in. I want you to see if you can do this. And then I was pretty excited because that was amazing. The next day I went to Scholastic and met Tracy Mack, who's now my editor there. She was the executive editor there. I spent an hour and a half with her and her assistant talking about, and she said exactly the same thing. And at the end of the meeting she said, I'll look at anything you do, as long as you write it. Here's my phone number, here's my email address, here's my home email address. I don't care what it is, just send it. I'm interested. So I can be dumb about a lot of things, but I perked up and thought, okay, I would be an idiot to say no at this point. I came back to Toronto, took a writing class with Peter Carver, quite a few classes with Peter Carver. And somewhere in there I wrote Grumpy Bird, but Peter never saw it because it was terrible. And Peter only saw things that I spent months or weeks perfecting. And then I went back to New York to see Tracy Mack at Scholastic and show her a dozen manuscripts that I had written, and I'd slaved over these things. But about 2 days before I went, Hermione gave me this idea for a book, and she was only 3. She said, draw grumpy things. And I drew grumpy things, and she had a list. A grumpy bird was on the list. There was a grumpy snake, a grumpy bear, a grumpy clock, and a grumpy lion. But the bird made both of us laugh. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to New York. I'm going to write one more book. I don't have time to make it good. It took 20 minutes to scribble down a story. It took me another day on Adobe Photoshop drawing one bird and copying and pasting him onto every page, and then each other animal. It was a really crude book dummy. I went to New York. I met with Tracy. She politely read through these 12 manuscripts that I had, making little comments. And then she said, have you got anything else? I said, well, no, not really. But while I said no, my hand went into my bag and pulled out Grumpy Bird and put it on her desk. And she said, oh, you do have another one. And she read Grumpy Bird. And by the time she got to the end, she was laughing. And she asked if she could keep it, which I thought, sure. Why not? I was pretty depressed at that point, figuring she's politely read these things. My chances with her are done, and maybe if I'm lucky, she'll find something for me to illustrate. But a week later, she called me and she said, I love this book, and I would love to publish it, but it needs work. If you're willing to work on spec, I can't pay you. Work for as long as it takes to make this good. I will take it to an acquisitions meeting for you and see if I can get you a book deal. And all of a sudden, the kid who hated reading had a whole new career. Making books. So it was Grumpy Bird. Me Hungry followed in 2008. I landed a pretty sweet agent in the process of doing Grumpy Bird. She helped me sell Me Hungry to Candlewick Press. Boohoo Bird, 2009. Piggy Bunny was 2012 because I stupidly, when Boohoo Bird was done, I decided I'm going to write something much bigger. I'm going to write this book I've always wanted to do called Clover the Uncredible, and started working. And as the months turned over into a couple of years, my agent Holly said, how are you making a living? I said, I'm hungry. She said, okay, we got a problem here. Let's get you some illustration work. And she hooked me up through publishers with Rachel Vale, who wrote Piggy Bunny for me, based on my drawing, which was kind of fun. And then It's a Tiger came from David La Rochelle with Chronicle Press. And this book, of all my books, is my favorite book. Favorite illustrations, anyway. Here Comes Distractosaurus. It's I think my last slide. Will be out early next year. I'm working on a book with Dennis Lee, which I think will be out next year. Clover the Uncredible will be out 2015, I think. We shall see. So this is with Aaron Reynolds of Creepy Carrots fame. He wrote a wonderful book about Godzilla, basically, destroying New York City. There's a mock-up of Clover the Uncredible. That's what my studio looks like in Vancouver. It's very small. I've got a lot of bookshelves, but I'm not going to take photos of them. So that's what my drafting table looks like. I was doing the cover for Here Comes Distractosaurus when I took that photo. I'm going to do one last thing. Oh, that's my haunted house. That lives behind my, this is a Cintiq. You guys, some people know what they are, some don't. It's a drawing tablet, plugs into my computer. It's big and it is beautiful. And I do all of my coloring and assembling of art using the Cintiq and my computer. And the haunted house was a birthday present from 2 children who thought Daddy is still a kid, so they bought me a Lego set. But I'm going to finish this off by doing an illustration using the computer. You're going to have to bear with me for a second because I was going to throw my glasses on the floor for a sec. I'm going to try something I've never tried in front of an audience before. Shall see if it works. But in the meantime, running a bit late, I can take questions while I do this. I'll just be a little slow in my answering of questions, but I might ask somebody to help with whoever is asking me questions. Yep.
But you also had a book. So do you do your basically what look to me like the ink illustrations then in the book and scan them in?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's exactly what I do. So I draw in a sketchbook. I draw with ink. I do not often use pencils. I like the mistakes that ink makes. Drawing with ink, I started when I was 13, and my dad said real artists use pens, not pencils. And he bought us a sketchbook and took us to England, where we went around to historical sites and drew pictures. And drawing with a pen, like a real artist, was an eye-opener for me, because pens make lots of mistakes and you can't fix them. So pens taught me to live with mistakes. And the brush took it to the whole other level of mistakes. And I've learned to accept all my mistakes that come with working with a brush and to love them. And I love the brush for there's a quality of line that brushes make, especially when they get kind of dried out and scratchy. Can I have the lights on at the front just to take a photo? Please? Okay. That might help. Might not help a lot, but it might help a little bit. Any other questions? Shoot.
I'm just a little confused. You have that palette there that goes into your computer.
Yep.
That you said you drew on, and you just said you were drawing with inks.
I mostly draw with ink, and I'm going to show you, because I did a couple of drawings before we started talking. And actually, you can turn the lights down again now. Thank you. So I'm just using my camera as a scanner, because traveling with a scanner is not an easy thing to do. But traveling with a camera is a very easy thing to do. So yes, I still draw with ink. I am actually Clover the Uncredible. I'm drawing using a program called Manga Studio, which is a comic book drawing software. And it is amazing what it can do. So let's open up iPhoto here. And okay, so here we got, I'm just going to download that one picture. I'm going to get rid of all the gray as much as we possibly can. Okay, there we go. All right, boost the black as much as we can. Okay, now we've got, actually it's mostly good. It's not perfect, but let's take out even more of the white. There we go. All right, so bird, save as, bird, JPEG. Sure. And I brought a small drawing tablet. It's not nearly as nice as the one I use at home, but it'll do. Say Wacom Bamboo. It is the cheapest product that Wacom makes. It costs about $70. Okay, we're gonna close that. And we're going to go to Corel Painter. And we're going to open bird JPEG. I probably should have fixed this because he's probably huge. No, maybe okay actually. Need a bigger brush though. I think 100. Okay, that's pretty big. And that looks like a good bird blue. I'm going to add a new layer. And I'm going to paint him using something that kind of mimics oil paint. Doesn't quite, but so bear with me. This might take a minute because the oil paint tool, while it is pretty awesome, takes a little bit longer than some of the other tools.
It resembles oil paint in terms of its density or with the brush?
It mixes like oil paint, but it also, I don't know if you can see on there. It's got a brush stroke on it. Yeah. Yes. It does a pretty great job mimicking a lot of things. It doesn't do a great job mimicking the way I like to use a brush. It does an okay job, but it's not as spontaneous. And actually, one of the things I love about working with ink is the spontaneity of it and the mistakes. Whereas when you have an undo key, it's actually very easy to not live with the mistakes, and you want to make them perfect. Let's color his shoes. Okay, now we're going to take that blue layer. I'm going to multiply it, which means make it transparent here. We're going to get some white. We'll get some gray, a little bit of red. And I'm going to get this thing. It's a blending stump. It's actually designed for blending pencil drawings. But I found it actually works pretty great blending oils as well. But I need a much bigger size one. So let's go. Bear with me. I'm working as fast as I possibly can. Okay, there we go. I'll need about 5 minutes of your attention.
Did you say oil painting is toxic?
Traditional oils are quite toxic unless you're working in a well-ventilated space. This is not toxic at all, at least not to me. I'm sure it is for the people who build these things, though. But I try not to think about that too hard, because I'm like that, because I like my technology, even if it's probably not good for the world.
Are you on the brush again?
This is a blending stump still. So it's not a brush, but it works nicely with the brush. Okay, that cheek is a little too big, but we're just going to live with that because one doesn't want to be a perfectionist in front of an audience. We could be here all night if that were the case. Okay, we're going to save as bird PSD. There we go. We're going to get rid of bird. Why is he not going on? Because it's saving. There we go. Talks amongst yourselves. This is the point in the process where I usually have a few sips of water and check my email.
Other questions? More questions? Not just a technical, just,
Sure.
is it more benefits working with Draw than Photoshop?
I avoided Painter for a great many years. But only a couple of years ago, I fell in love with Painter because it's become much more user-friendly. And I think maybe I just spent enough time on it to get the hang of it. I also started reading a magazine called Imagine FX, which is a fantasy and sci-fi digital art magazine. And I'm not a big sci-fi and fantasy art kind of guy, but a lot of the people who are doing fantasy art in particular, they are absolutely on the cutting edge of using technology to mimic traditional looks because there's such a market for traditional sci-fi and fantasy art. So, okay, I know what we're going to do here. just going to move my layers around. I'm going to put a black layer on top, make it invisible or transparent, the colored one underneath, and we're going to get a little brush here. But anyway, reading ImagineFX, I learned a huge number of techniques from looking at all these people who are interested in mimicking traditional. Don't want to color outside the lines, that would be bad. Okay, there we go. I'll take that as a compliment. Thank you. Okay, there we go. I'm going to take a magic wand, select everything, and delete. Clean up all that. Okay, there we go. Let's build a new document here that is 9 by 9 by, say, 250. RGB. There we go. Okay, now we're going to take a bird and link those two layers. I'm going to grab that, drag them over here, where they will be much too big. But that is okay, because we can make them much, much smaller. Let's put them that big, okay. This won't be quite like the art in Grumpy Bird, because those took a little bit longer to do than the 5 minutes I'm going to spend on it here. Okay, so we got that. Let's move it over. We're going to get a photograph. Has anybody here seen me do this before? Oh, good. I'm a one-trick pony, so I'd feel very embarrassed if you were seeing me do this again. I take a lot of photographs. I'm not a great photographer, but I love my camera. I take photographs of anything I think I can use. So there's a sky. Why is it not going down there? There we go. You know what, let's get rid of that layer, because that one is in the way. Okay, we got a sky. We're going to get... You've probably seen me do this before.
No, I didn't.
Really?
No.
Seriously? Yeah, this is Photoshop. Photoshop is the most amazing finishing tool. Trees, I love trees. Trees are like people, they're all different. I take a lot of photographs of trees, and Heather probably thinks I'm a little crazy because I take pictures of trees. Okay, here is, this is a drawing from my sketchbook. Every now and then in my sketchbook something shows up and I'm like, you know what, I could use that. I scan it. So this particular drawing of a tight-knit forest has been used in many illustrations and in Grumpy Bird and Boohoo Bird. Same with this. I drew this maybe 14 years ago, these trees. I'm still using them. Make that transparent. Leaves. I like leaves. Okay, we're going to make them blue. Make a nice dark. There we go. There, that's a good blue. Drag them across. These ones got used in the bird books quite a bit. Those particular leaves, I'm going to flip them over. I'm going to rotate them. I should hold my palette somewhere that is a little bit better than other places I could be holding it. Some of you have had the misfortune of seeing my old Toronto house and the backyard that we had that grew out of control every summer and had this truly hideous garage that we eventually had to knock down so we could sell the house. But if only removing a garage were as easy as this. Okay, so get rid of the garage so we can see that nice picture we built. But, okay, the photo is a little bit too obvious, so I'm going to get rid of most of it, but not all of it. Oh, I don't want that. I want a brush. Photoshop actually is a fun program to draw and paint with as well, because you can build your own brushes in it. So it comes with a lot of preset ones, which are good. But then, just by experimentation, you can build your own. So this is a brush I built that kind of mimics watercolors, sort of, vaguely, a little bit. Let's get some green. A slightly bigger brush. And we want a slightly lower opacity. I'm going to cover most of it. There'll be a little bit sticking through there, which will make good. Kind of also looks like a sponge painting, I guess. And we're going to get another brush. I'm almost done. Are there any other questions?
I was wondering, you said that the applicant of Chloe was not going to be done until 2015?
Well, yep.
And I was just wondering why so long? To me, it just seems like a long time. Like, I have no idea what it's like in the publishing world.
I have no idea what it's like either. I honestly don't understand some of the lead times they have. It'll be done about 1.5 years before it shows up in stores. That's just the way that some of the big publishers work. Some of the Canadian ones work with smaller windows, which would be nice. But instead, I do these things and then forget about them, and then they show up on my doorstep like 1 year later, and then a few months later, people are buying them. It's kind of nice, but actually I've been working on it for 5 years, and it's still not done. I'm on draft number 20-something, but in terms of good drafts, it's draft number 2.
Your work is amazing.
Thank you. It's very kind of you. I'll grab another brush. What a great question. I am in discussions with Scholastic about doing another bird book. They would love to do one. I would love to do one. I'm very critical of authors who do the same thing over and over again and who write the same book over and over again. And I know they sell really well. And maybe I'm just inexperienced enough that I haven't figured out how to do that yet. But I'm also kind of reluctant to take on another project that will take 1.5 years of my life if I'm not 300% in love with the thing. Because I have to live with it for a very long time, answering emails about it, doing corrections on it. And by the time a book is done, I've illustrated the whole thing about 6 times. Because I keep going back and changing things and fixing things, trying other approaches to it. But yes, another bird book would be lovely. I'm bandying around a number of ideas, but none that are quite perfect yet.
Has there been any talk or to animate these?
Yeah. Grumpy Bird was options about 3 years ago, but we got as far as negotiating the contracts, and then the contracts never showed up. So some piece of funding might have fallen through.
But you're on Kindle too then?
Allegedly, I haven't seen the ebooks. I am, however, doing an interactive book. I'm redoing Me Hungry completely from the bottom up as a fully interactive thing. I don't know what it's going to be like, but it's kind of interesting. It keeps being put aside to work on the other projects I've got going on.
So where do we buy this?
You can look at it. This is the downside about digital art, is either I have to make prints of them, or I don't know what the answer is for digital art in terms of getting them out in front of people who want them. People email me and ask if they can have them every now and then, and I print them out. But any more questions?
I have a quick question.
Absolutely.
Actually, I have two, if you'll indulge me.
Yeah,
First
of
question is, what advice would you give to an author that's just starting out and establishing relationships with publishers?
Just an author or author illustrator or both?
Yeah, both, I guess. I'm an author myself, so
Okay.
I'm asking a selfish question.
It's kind of hard to say, but in my own story, a couple of people have told me is a fairy tale, but it does happen clearly, and I was lucky. But being an illustrator, it's a heck of a lot easier to get noticed than it is when you're a writer. The best advice is to learn to write, and I'm sure if you want to be a writer, you're probably a very good writer already. I would strongly suggest taking a writing for children class if that's what you want to write. There are also fiction writing classes for adults and stuff, I'm sure. But I learned an immense amount taking Peter Carver's writing class through George Brown. It was such an eye-opener. And just taking that class, I know for anybody who is pitching book to children's publishers, having taken that class, they've got not just one, not just two, but probably 3 or 4 legs up on their competition. And I've asked interns who go through the slush piles at the big publishers, and they say, well, it's pretty easy. It's, almost right away, just throw them out. But every now and then you get something that's good, and a lot of those come from people who have either really worked on their craft or have taken classes to improve their craft. So that's number one. Number two is just pitch it, and don't get fussy about agents necessarily. The best advice I've received about agents is pitch to agents and pitch to publishers, but the agents are much more likely to listen if the publisher is interested in you. Oh, really? They want to work with you? It's easy money for them because they didn't have to sell your work. You've done that yourself. They just get to collect their 15% of everything you make.
That was really wonderful. That was amazing.